All right. Well, good evening, everybody. This is the Fiscal and Economic April meeting. My name is Bill Davis. I'm the co-chapter lead of NWSOFA, which stands for Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action. We are an indivisible chapter. When you see our name, NWSOFA, that stands for Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action. We are located in the land beyond O'Hare. We have 5,200 members. We cover 6 townships, and our leadership team, which is composed of 24 all-volunteer leads, they manage our 10 issue teams and our communications team. So everybody does a really good job. Tonight, we have Fiscal and Economics team. Next Tuesday, we will have our Stand with Women group, and then on the following Monday, we will have our Restore Our Democracy group, ROD we call them, talking about the 2025 Republican concept. And then we'll have climate change the next night on that Tuesday. And then on that Thursday, we'll have our gun violence prevention group. And we have all kinds of groups that we help co-sponsor in between that. So to one of our longer groups, longer lasting groups, Fiscal and Economic, Karl and David have been, I think for a good 8 years, been running this group and bringing us new, interesting facts, whether we like them or not. They keep them well documented, and it's been kind of nice for the last couple of years because most of the data is very positive. So I'll turn it over to Karl.
Welcome, everybody. Glad you could make it and join us tonight. This, as Bill said, is the April meeting of the Fiscal and Economic Issues Discussion Group of NWSOFA. So what we try and do here is help you understand what the facts are so you can use those facts to sharpen your arguments and communicate to your audience whatever that audience is, whether it's in-person discussions or blogs, comment sections of the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Fox News. So anywho, let's start with the labor market. Let's start with the labor market. We had labor market employment report come out last Friday, and payroll jobs went up by 303,000, which was a big number in March. Prior months were adjusted up about 22,000. So the total jobs are up 325,000 versus what we reported last month. And job creation is averaging 400,000 a month under Biden, so 15.2 million over 38 months. As you can see, we had a pre-pandemic peak in February of 2020. We passed that peak in July of 2022 after losing 22 million jobs over the course of 2 months. And we're currently sitting at 103.1 million, or almost 6 million more jobs than the prior peak. To kind of smooth this out, we've got 3-month moving averages, and you can see that 3-month moving average has been moving down. After we lost those 22 million jobs in 2 months back in 2020, we've had pretty good job growth, including under Trump and then under Biden. After we got to where we regained all the jobs lost during that period, we have still been averaging more jobs being added in this period. Sorry about that. Fingers are getting, And so this is more jobs added than was true during the pre-pandemic Trump years. The unemployment rate, which is the U3 rate, has been 4% or lower since December of 2021. So there's 26 straight months below 4%, which is more than a 50-year record. The U3 rate is people who are unemployed, did not work during the month, were looking for work during the month, where the U6 rate is people who were all of those people, but also people who have looked for a job in the prior year, not just the prior month, and also people who are working part-time but want full-time employment. So it's a more inclusive definition of unemployed, and that's why it's higher, but it's still relatively low versus historic numbers.
So, Karl, the difference between the U6 and the U3, those are people who are not looking for work that are unemployed.
No, the U6 are people who they haven't necessarily looked for work in the last month, but they've looked at some point in the last year.
Okay. And it looks like there's a fairly consistent differential between the U3 and the U6, or at least for the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. This is average unemployment rates, which gives people the benefit if you're starting on third base, your average is relatively low. Where Reagan, he started with a 7.5% unemployment rate. So he started in the hole, but he's actually the only Republican president who had the unemployment rate go down on his watch. So I'm going to suggest to David that as opposed to average unemployment rate for a president, we go for change in unemployment rate during the presidency.
We can, and we can also cheer that Biden is 100% behind LBJ as having the lowest unemployment rate of any president, at least back to the 1964.
Yeah.
So he will probably catch up in the next couple of months, barring a big surprising jump in the unemployment rate. He will have the lowest unemployment rate on average of any president. And this is a carefully guarded secret. Has anybody seen anything remotely like this in the media? No. So we try to always put Biden in a good light if we can, and he certainly can. In this one, it's really a great achievement for a president, at least to take credit for his killer economy.
Yeah, but we have Trump as a relatively low unemployment rate, where the unemployment rate was 4.7% when he took office and 6.3% when he left office, which is not exactly a positive number and a positive achievement. We've got him as the number 4 in terms of unemployment rate based on an average.
And Republicans always give him a mulligan for his last year in office, right? They pretend that 2020 didn't happen. So he's always going to look good in their eyes. They're going to want to know what's the pre-pandemic number. And with that, I don't know what the pre-pandemic number is for Trump. I haven't looked at it, but it would be lower than this. It would be much closer to where Biden is if we took out 2020. But still, it's great news for Biden, and it's worth sharing.
Certainly, yes. Now, this is not bad news. I just think that it's fairer to show that what the direction is under Democratic and Republican presidents, because Reagan is the only Republican president that had the unemployment rate go down on his watch, and every one of these Democrats had the unemployment rate go down on their watch.
That's right.
Albeit Carter was a tiny fraction of a percent.
Stay tuned. We'll show you next month.
Okay. So anyhow, we talked about the establishment survey, which is a 303,000 new jobs. And here is the household survey, which is this is where we got the unemployment rate. This is a survey of, I think, about 60,000 households, give or take, done every month. And so we see this month is pretty much all good news. Population grew, the labor force grew by more than the population as more people were entering the labor force. So the participation rate went up a little bit. The number of employed went up by 498,000, which is, of course, bigger than that 303,000 new payroll jobs. And over the course of a year, the household survey will tend to about mirror the establishment survey for number of new jobs, number of new employees, but they don't match every month. So that's why we see, get back here, we see 498,000 more employed versus the 303,000 new payroll jobs. So anyhow, it's all good news. So this is understanding those, and you got the population, you got the labor force and not in the labor force. Those in the labor force are either employed or unemployed. Population excludes military, incarcerated, people in nursing homes. Employed is both full-time and part-time workers. Unemployed for the U3 is, again, looked for work in the past 4 weeks. And not in the labor force are people like me who are retired or people who are in school. or stay-at-home parents or caregivers. And this is where we get the share not in the labor force has been increasing as the country ages, because we've got about, I forget what it is, 10,000 people a day turning 65. So you've got a number that's going to retire.
It's like 4.5 million a year turning 65.
Yeah. The employment to population ratio is slightly above the pre-pandemic level. And this is the prime working age. So it will tend to not include a lot of students or retirees. And we see is when we had the big drop with the pandemic, and we've been recovering since then. And the share that's part-time or government or multiple job holders is similar to pre-pandemic. So it's not a lot of government jobs that have come in. It's not a lot of part-time jobs that have come in. And basically the number of multiple job holders is very similar to where we were at prior to the pandemic. And this is where a fair amount of discussion has come in the last few months about the fact that immigrants are key to the labor force expansion. That if we didn't have immigrants, the labor force would have shrunk. On the other hand, those immigrants are not the people that crossed the border last week. Many of those immigrants are, as you see in the, I don't know what color is this, orangish, pinkish, whatever. These are foreign-born U.S. citizens. And then we've got non-citizens, many of whom are legal residents, but some of them are not. Anything else you want to say about this group, David, this slide?
Just say you're going to deal with a lot of misinformation about this out there. So just be aware of what we just said, which is that the immigrants are the ones that are driving this recovery in terms of the jobs, that you've got millions of mainly white boomers turning 65 and many of those retiring. And so you've got, without these immigrants coming in, your economy's not going to grow, your employment level's not going to grow. Immigration is why the economy is doing as well as it is.
Okay.
A big part of it, yeah.
So this is, I learned that 10,000 a day a couple of years ago, and I guess it's gone up since then to the 4.4 million boomers turning 65 each year. Now, not all of them are retiring at 65. All of us are retiring at some point.
And some of the ones that retired or that turned 65 last year didn't retire then, but they're retiring this year. So
Yeah.
it's hard to know how many retired. And this is the first time I've seen this data. This was shared by Stephen Ratner, who was the you guys know him from MSN. He's the chart guy on MSNBC Morning Joe, and he worked in the Obama administration. But you can see the retired among the native born. But between 2019 and 2023, there's about 4 million more that retired. That number actually seems low to me. I would think that would be higher, but that's the number that it is. And on the immigrant side, even you've got some more retired too. There are plenty of people that were foreign born into the U.S. that have worked for many years and are retiring. Some boomers are also older. And then employed, though you're seeing the green bar almost all on the immigrant side, there isn't a lot more of the native born because it's a net number. There's a lot of people that are just retiring. There's just not a lot more of the native born showing up. And most of the ones that want to work are working. So it's this other number. The red bar is the one I'm struggling with, is unemployed / not in the labor force. And maybe Karl, you have some insight here. I don't, those are very different concepts. And so when somebody is unemployed or not in the labor force, that's just, it was a surprising label for me. And I'm not able to replicate this data with Fred, so I wasn't sure how to get it. But I trust the source, and it just, not in the labor force makes more sense to me, not so much the unemployed being a lot larger. I'm surprised to see more native born unemployed. Makes more sense to see not in the labor force.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll try and work it a little bit over the next month.
If anybody's got insight on that, I'd like to know, because I don't see how not in labor force makes a lot of sense, which is they're retired. The number that are, but I guess we've got a retired bucket. So what exactly does that mean if they're not in the labor force? They're caregivers or in school. It's a strange number. I've got to dig into it and figure out what was meant there. I looked at it, but I couldn't find a good reason.
Okay. The JOLTS, the job openings versus, we see is that the job openings as of January were 8.8 million, and then unemployment level was 6.5 million, which means that there's a few more job openings than there are unemployed. And that's how you get that 1.36 ratio of 8.8 million to 6.5 million, which is a fairly healthy number, getting back down to the pre-pandemic level. We don't want this to do what we did here, where the unemployment level was way higher than the job openings, which was true from January or February of 2020 out to early middle of 2021.
All right, we just got a couple questions. Sorry, Karl, he just came in. We got two of them. Does
Great.
government jobs include state government? Yes, it does. And what is the effect of immigrant labor on overall wages? Well, we're going to see that wages are growing just fine despite all these immigrants that are coming in. So could they potentially be higher if immigrants had not been coming in and there was even more competition for jobs potentially? But also with the economy booming and growing and all these extra people here that are demanding goods and services, that tends to go the other direction. So it's just hard to tell. What we can tell is that wages have outgrown inflation, and that's what we're going to talk about here.
And we go back to the start of the pandemic, opposed to the start of the Biden presidency, for a number of reasons, including the weird stuff that happened with wages early in the pandemic when low-wage people lost their jobs. And so average wages went up as 22 million people lost their jobs. Okay, so what we see here is hourly wages since the beginning of the pandemic are about almost 24% higher. The overall CPI is about 20% higher. Core CPI, excluding food and energy, is about 18%. So wages have outpaced inflation since the beginning of the pandemic. Real hourly wages are higher than in 2019. Again, this was when most of which were low wage jobs, as restaurants, bars, etc., all shut down. And my favorite Chinese restaurant still hasn't reopened for in-restaurant dining. They just do carry out and delivery. So you have the average wages went down for a period, a couple of years, and now they've been coming back up. But the average wages are higher than prior to the pandemic.
This is just more detail behind that, Karl, kind of, by phase. And then also this is for all the wages, all hourly wages, not just the production and non-supervisory. And that's why where that dotted line shows up, for a little while, we actually dip below that line when you look at all the employees, all the workers, because the lower wage workers have actually had bigger increases than the higher wage. So when you throw in the higher wage, it sort of slows down the increase. For a little while, we were below, but again, nearly the entire post-pandemic or the recovery period, the wages were higher than pre-pandemic.
Okay.
So the idea that people are suffering, some people are suffering from inflation, but on average, people are better off and have been throughout the pandemic than before based on this measure.
Yes.
Karl, I have a question for you.
We'll see if I have any.
Okay, 2 slides back, you showed the average hourly wage at 29.71. And when I was looking at the BLS this last week, it had said that in March, the average hourly earnings for all employees on private non-farm payrolls increased to 34.69%.
That would be 34 something dollars an hour.
Yeah.
I'll go to the next slide. Go to the one with all the drama on it from a real economist. There you go. Now that's interesting. Oh, you know what? He's measuring in December 2020 dollars here. So he's talking
Right.
about all of them. Your number's the right number. I remember a number in that range too. That's for everybody. So that includes the higher paid workers as well. 34 an hour is about right in today's dollars. I'm going to go check it here in a second just to make sure, but it's because he's using 2020 dollars here that it looks funky. If he was using 2024 dollars, it would probably be 34.
Yeah, it's unclear to me whether or not the non-supervisory employees were in that or not.
Yeah, they're in this one, and they're
Okay.
along with some of the higher paid workers. The other one is the one above it that Karl showed just before the slide before, is just those production non-supervisory, which is like the bottom 80% of private sector workers. It's a huge chunk of them, but doesn't have the highest paid people in it. That's why I like this number better. It's closer to a median number. It's closer to a middle class kind of number without the high paid people. Yeah, I'm looking right now at at Fred, the average hourly earnings of all employees total private is $34.69 in March 2024. That's where that, if you weren't using 2020 dollars, we were using 2024 dollars, that we would see that scale would be higher.
Thank you.
Any other questions out there?
Yeah, I have a couple in the chat. I don't want to interrupt, but I'm just wondering if you guys know what the minimum wages are.
Which state?
Yeah, federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. State and local minimum wages are generally higher than that. I think Illinois might be 14 and Chicago might be 15 an hour. And of course, California fast food workers are 20 an hour.
Thank you. That's helpful. And I mean, 725 is so low, it's hard to believe. And I don't think it's been adjusted for inflation. Like, when is the last time it's gone up? But that's a whole topic.
The last went up in 2009. I think that's right. It went up in 2007, 2008, 2009. But very few people are being paid at minimum wage, the $7.25. Most people are making more than that. As we talked about, if the average wage is $34,000, that's 17 an hour. So that's substantially more than the minimum wage.
30 states have a minimum wage above that federal minimum. It's becoming less and less of a thing, although 20 states still are still using it. So it's 30 out of 50 states have higher than that.
But again, those states that still have that as a minimum wage, the market generally is going to be higher than that for most employees. So most people in those states are going to be making more than the state mandated minimum wage.
Thank you, guys.
Okay.
This is just showing that if you look at the different groups within those wage gainers, you got the top 10% have actually seen slower or less wage growth than the bottom of the spectrum. So it's sort of inequality is improving based on this. Those lower wage workers have really prospered in terms of the gains in their wages, while the higher wage workers did not see the size increases. And so we've shared the averages on the previous slides. These are a breakdown in the different groups, but the bottom's doing better than the top, which is rare, not typical. This is just the long-term view. I just want to point out to people that as much as the media loves to say that the real wages have gone down lately, because they look at that artificial peak and they know. I mean, the economic journalists know that they're kind of lying to us, but they still say the real wages are down under Biden. You can see just how high those wages are. Nearly the entire Biden era, 2021 to 2023, is in that upper right corner, higher than nearly our entire history. And if you take out that artificial bump there in 2020, we actually have, if you take out the 2020 and 2021 readings, which are kind of artificially inflated, real wages are the highest they've ever been around now. I think January was slightly higher than February, but January was the highest real wage reading ever, January 2024, outside of that pandemically boosted figure in that 2020 range. So if you pretend 2020 and 2021 didn't happen, we've got incredibly high real wages right now. And real means inflation adjusted. So that's all factored in. We just have part of why the economy is booming is because people have really strong wages right now historically.
Looking at this, one of the things I remember is that the women's workforce participation was lower here. And so as women came into the workforce, real wages tended to go down, average real wages tended to go down, because we weren't paying the women as much because they didn't have the work experience that the men did.
If you're generous, if we weren't just discriminating against them.
Well, I lived through that, okay?
The women aren't laughing on this call. I hear no one else laughing but me. That's right. But yeah, that's a good reason, is the supply, kind of like the question earlier about immigrants. Are immigrants depressing the wages? if that's the case, it's not all, or look at how high these wages are historically. Second, it's nothing like what happened in the 70s to 90s when women came into the workforce like gangbusters, and the wages fell on average.
Yeah. So we've got real net worth per household for the bottom 50%, and it's up 53% versus pre-pandemic, the 36,000 in the fourth quarter of 2019 versus 55,000 in the fourth quarter of 2023. And then we go to the next group, the 50 to 90th percentile. Again, bigger numbers, but again, the didn't go up quite as much. This was the market went down in 2022. And so that was an issue for people in this category that actually own stocks.
I can take this one, Karl.
Okay.
This will give a headache to most normal humans. What I'm trying to do here is show you each of the groups across the top, and then starting with the first row, the fourth quarter of 2019, what was the net worth of each of those groups? This is in trillions of dollars. And so you can see that top one in the next group, the next 9%. If you added those numbers together, you'd have like 90-ish, 91 trillion, 92 trillion. And then the bottom 50% only had 2.3 trillion. So half the households only have a tiny fraction of that 131 total there over on the right. So you just add up those numbers in the columns and they add up to 131.6. Same idea with 2023. The number for the top 10% is more like 100 trillion. Bottom group's only 4, but we're seeing these big wealth increases. This is real, adjusted for inflation. So every group is seeing significant dollar gains, and the percentage gains are listed here in that fourth row. The bottom 50% being up almost 57%, slightly different from the other one. This is per household, and the number of households changes over time. That's why it's not the 53% you saw earlier, but it's very close. The US is 12% richer in real terms since pre-pandemic, and you can see who got the percent increases. The bottom 50% actually larger percent increases than everybody else. That fifth row is a little more complicated. That is the increase that each group got in dollars divided by that total dollar increase there. So it's like for the first group, the top 1%, it would be the 4.5 trillion increase, 4.52 divided by 15.54 over at the right. So that means the top 1% captured about 29% of the increase in wealth during that time. And then the bottom 50% only got 9% of the increase in wealth. They got 1.33 trillion out of 15.54. Those numbers in the third row. So that's how you calculate that fifth row. It's the share of the total increase that they got, and then the share of the net worth overall. So out of the total number, that 131 trillion in the upper right corner, that's what the top 1% had. They had 30.4% of the wealth in 2019, and then they had 30.3 in 2023, so it went down just slightly. And in fact, the top 10%, those first two columns, had declines, while the bottom 90% actually had increases. So what that means is wealth inequality improved since pre-pandemic, but still that bottom 50% only owns 2.5% of the wealth. That's the bottom 50% column. The 2.5% is the second thing from the second to bottom row. So that's kind of how this table works. Any questions about the mechanics of it? I know it's a lot of information, but it also gives you all the key numbers in one page. And then there's an English translation of it below that you can just read, and then you can kind of refer back up to the table as you read it to see where those numbers are. Just looking at the chat to see if we've got any questions. We got one. Let's see. Nope. Just a general statement. But if anybody's got questions, you can speak up or write it in the chat, and we will tackle it.
Okay. And this is assets by wealth group.
So this one, you've got there's a key over on the right hand side. But what I'm using just for space is that for that 50th to 90th group, that top bucket. These are trillions of dollars, is real estate. That's the sort of blue or teal color. Durable goods are things like cars and TVs and washing machines and dryers. stock being the equity, the stock market. Pension, that would be what they call a defined benefit pension. So that's the old school kind of pension that people had. And the 401k is the defined contribution pension elements. And then the business is the green one. So like if somebody owns their own business, and then the gray is other assets, which are a little confusing thing, but they've got some checking accounts and money market accounts. If you own bonds that are outside of muni funds, so if you happen to own individual bonds, things like that, they don't include that in the other buckets. So it's a little tricky to figure out exactly what's in each bucket, but there are definitions of it that are listed along with this data, the Fed distributional data. So this is, but you can get a sense of when you look at that bottom 50% group, it's all real estate. They don't have a lot of stock. Stock is heavily concentrated with rich people. And as you move to the left, you see that brown bucket gets to be a larger share of each of the columns. And the real estate starts shrinking after in that top 1% because they have most of their money is in businesses or in stocks, so they don't have as much of it in real estate. You can only own so many houses. You can get an infinite amount of stock, but you're even people with 8 houses are not typical. Most people own one, a couple if they're really, really rich. You can kind of see how the distribution of the money changes as you work your way to the left. And then at the bottom, those bottom 50% just have very little stock. This is housing. And so I've got the real, so that's inflation adjusted and nominal here. And this will bore you, but from an analytical perspective, if anybody ever puts the nominal and real on the same slide and is using today's dollars, you're going to get a pattern that looks just like this. The real line is going to be above the nominal line, and it's going to get to be a bigger separation as you go further back in time, because inflation, you gross up the stuff from years and years ago more because inflation has accumulated more. So that's why you get this pattern when you share both pieces of information. But you can see housing prices, the blue line went from like 327,000 before the pandemic to all the way up around where were they 480,000. So almost 150,000 increase, almost a 50% increase in the nominal price of homes in just 4 years. Just an incredible jump. And in real terms, adjusted for inflation, it's not quite that pronounced. But and then lately, coming into 2023, housing prices have actually fallen quite a bit from their 2022 peaks. Housing, as we mentioned, is a big part of the wealth, particularly of the bottom group. That's part of why when you look at history, we had shown you a chart that went back further for the net worth of the bottom 50% group. It was almost entirely wiped out by the Great Recession because people were very leveraged in homes. They bought homes they couldn't afford, and they had big mortgages, and then the price of those homes went way, way down. And then in many cases, those homes were foreclosed upon, and people lost what little net worth they had. And so not what's happening now. Things are the opposite direction, but still the prices are way above are now not really way above the pre-pandemic anymore on the real line. 418 versus 391, about a 7% increase in real terms, 28% in nominal terms. So that difference being the approximate 20% inflation that Karl shared with you before. So that's kind of real and nominal when you're analyzing them together. And that's why you see this formula up at the top, the 308, that's the actual, that was the fourth quarter reading, the fourth quarter average of the CPI index, just FYI. We won't bore you. I don't bore you typically with these analytical details, but if you ever run into a chart like this, that's kind of how it works. And that's where you're using the latest dollars for everything is in the latest dollars on that real line. And despite lots of complaining about home affordability and how the media loves to use the word crisis, there's an immigration crisis. Who's that for exactly? Who's really in crisis? Probably the immigrants, not the white rural people who never see them. But it's a crisis. Just ask people that watch Fox News. But in here, you hear the home affordability crisis all the time. And guess what? Home ownership rates were actually higher in 2023 than before the pandemic for nearly all the age groups, except the 45 to 54. You often hear about how millennials and the younger generations are suffering terribly because they can't buy houses. There may be some truth to that, but they're not suffering any more than they were in 2019 because more of them own houses. You would expect if there was some kind of horrible housing crisis that the share of young people that own homes would be lower. And in fact, it's higher. So something to keep in mind whenever you see the word crisis in the news, be careful. It's probably not a real crisis. Every now and then we have real ones. The Great Recession was a real crisis. 2020, with the 22 million people losing their jobs in the pandemic, that was a crisis. We don't have it's arguable that we have an immigration crisis. It's arguable that we have a housing affordability crisis. So here is the sort of racetrack of, if you count how many days from election that the two presidents were, kind of to see what the cumulative gain in the stock market was at any given point. Biden started out sort of winning. He was ahead. He had a really great first year. And then the stock market kind of went sideways for a couple of years, and now it's back sprinting upward again. Trump actually, when you look at it, the pattern isn't all that different although he was higher for much of that time, until you get to the recent piece, and that big drop there in the red on the right is the pandemic. That's March of 2020. That's the March of Trump's last year, or now April, I guess. And we are in April of Biden's fourth year. And so Biden is way ahead right now. And Trump is going to catch up most likely, but it's going to take him a while before that red line creeps back up to where it was before. So we'll see if the stock market is going to continue on this trajectory, if it's going to flatten out for a while and Trump is going to catch up. But the bottom line is the stock market has done extremely well under Biden. There was a lot of complaining about 2022 and early 2023, but you've always been at the bottom there. You were always at least 8%, 7-8%, the bottom of the blue line. You were always at least 7 or 8% above pre-pandemic, or above when Biden was elected. And at one point we were 42% up there toward the end of, I think it was early 2022. And then now we're back up, 55% and well ahead of Trump right now. Another piece of good news for Biden. And this gets at household debt. So this is kind of, if you're hearing about households are getting crushed under credit card debt or housing debt or this kind of debt or that kind of debt, it helps to have some perspective that relative to the size of the economy, households have much less debt than they had during the housing bubble. That was when people had the giant mortgages and we had been just adding to household debt. And then the pandemic hit and people lost the homes, so that debt went away. A lot of foreclosures, or people just started paying down debt. And now we're at a level that's more consistent with like the 2000 era, kind of the end of the Clinton era. And so again, not a crisis. Crisis would have been at 2008 or 9. That would have been the Great Recession. Right now we're at a reasonable level. It'd be nice to be lower, but that's kind of where we are.
One thing to remember is that interest rates on that debt are higher now than they were for much of the period that's shown in this graph.
And so let's look at how that's affecting people. Take a look at the next slide. We'll go one more and then we'll come back to this one. So this is household debt service payments as a percent of income. So when you take all of the debt that households have, how is that stacking up as a percent of their income? That disposable means really after tax income. And it's actually lower than pre-pandemic. Pre-pandemic was about 10%, and now it's at about 9.8. So similar, but not, again, a crisis. For a little while there in 2020 and 2021, you see those spikes down. Those were because of the giant pandemic assistance packages. So the disposable income, which is the denominator in this equation, those numbers jumped. So now we're back to more normal pre-pandemic reading, which is very historically low. And to Karl's point, though, if we keep having these high interest rates, like we had back in the 80s, 90s, in the pre-Great Recession era, interest rates were higher, then we're going to see this number climbing. We'll see how high it climbs, but right now it's low. So again, there is no household debt crisis. Households are doing just fine. If you would, Karl, go back to that one that we skipped. I think this is an interesting piece of history. There you go. Historically, if you take this data back, and this one goes to 1970, but if you were to go back even further, what's always happened is people borrow, the household debt number goes up, and people borrow and spend that money. That's kind of how the economy grows. You see GDP growing, you see debt growing. That's kind of, we borrow and spend. And that's kind of what happened. And if you look kind of eyeball these numbers, that change, that percent that vertical axis is percent of GDP. If you kind of eyeball an average in there, it's somewhere around that 4 or 5% of GDP, going back before the Great Recession. But then for a while, it got up toward 10. And that's where things got out of hand with people buying all these very expensive, the housing bubble, and people buying mortgages they couldn't afford, buying houses they couldn't afford. And then all that stopped. All that giant borrowing and spending just was gone almost overnight. It just stopped in 2008. And for 4 years, 9, 10, 11, and 12, households were actually paying down debt. And that's a big reason why the economy was so slow. You kept hearing Republicans saying, oh, this is the worst recovery. It wasn't just Republicans. People were saying this is the worst recovery of any recession pretty much ever. And part of it is because in the last recessions, you see those vertical gray bars, people kept borrowing and spending right through the recessions. That's not what happened in 2008 and 9. That gray bar you see for the first time negative, meaning deleveraging. People were getting rid of leverage, means debt. People were getting rid of their leverage, getting rid of their debt. And now that number has come back up to around 2.5% of GDP, 2.6. So somewhere around, people are borrowing around $720 billion a year and spending that. That's kind of, if you look at sort of the pre-Great Recessions, a little bit lower. Those are lower figures, but they're consistent with the pre-pandemic. The Trump era, those 4 years there, those were pretty much consistent with that again. And the economy is doing just fine with that level. I just wanted you to understand we're not doing crazy borrowing right now. Crazy borrowing would be 10% of GDP. We're at 2.6, which is kind of low historically and consistent with pre-pandemic. All right, we got that one more. So we've talked about this one, but we'd be watching this one. So we just got the fourth quarter data. So the delinquencies have been popping, and they're now above the pre-pandemic. So this is one to keep watching. It gives you a sense of the pressure that are on people that may have overextended themselves a little bit on their credit cards. I mean, people are going to pay their rent. They're going to pay for their car so it doesn't get repoed, and they're going to not pay their credit card if that's what they have to do. And that's what is starting to happen more often. It's higher than pre-pandemic, but it's not unusual if you go back to that Great Recession or before the Great Recession when things were in that 4.5 or 5%, 4.5 range, it looks like, just eyeballing this chart all the way back to 1990. So higher than pre-pandemic. That's not a good thing, but not particularly high historically. So we'll see how high this climbs. We'll keep an eye on it. This is an interesting concept, the excess savings. The idea is that during the pandemic, people couldn't spend on services because they were shut down. And so people bought stuff. That's part of why you saw a lot of goods purchases and a lot of inflation on goods, but not services during sort of the lockdown phase, because there was no demand for services. People were not using them. And also the government was paying in a ton of benefits, the checks, the tax credits. And so you saw this blue section here is an accumulation of savings above that pre-pandemic savings rate. And then the red is actually spending it down. And so the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco is estimating that we peaked at about $2 trillion. We peaked at about $2 trillion in excess savings, and that is nearly exhausted now. You can tell by looking at the left graph that they are using an assumption that the savings rate was increasing. They're kind of drawing that upward sloping line. That wasn't always the case, meaning right before the pandemic, there was sort of this upward trend in savings in like that 29 period, which was a good thing. And now that savings is lower. What I'm getting at is if you were to use a flat line assumption, that dotted line you're seeing on the left side, sort of the projection of the trend, if you make that a flat line, you see a much larger accumulation of pandemic savings, of excess savings, and we still have up to $1 trillion or so of it. It just depends on which assumption you make on the trend in that pre-pandemic savings. And this is the Federal Reserve Bank. You can see some other Bank of America had it recently at about $800 billion still remaining. Depends on the economist, but I just wanted you to understand the concept. What this means is that if it's depleted, that means this has been helping boost spending. All this excess savings being spent has been boosting the economy. If that's gone, then you should expect to see growth slow. maybe faster than economists think. And so we'll see what the future holds, but it's just a warning indicator that if the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco is correct and that excess savings is gone, then I would expect to see GDP start dropping off over the next few quarters. We'll see if that actually happens. Are we done with this section? Yeah, so let's take a break and then we'll come back for kind of what's going on in other parts of the economy. So that section just sort of covered households and how are they doing. Net worth's great. Wages are up in real terms. Net worth's up in real terms. Housing and stock prices are up, which is why the net worth is up. And we're seeing some cracks appearing in the delinquencies, but the debt level generally is not crazy. And to Karl's point, if these high interest rates persist, that's going to put more pressure on households on that debt. Those interest payments are going to be higher. So